You are listening to the Gospel-Centered Education Podcast, brought to you by Community Christian School in Tallahassee, Florida.
Hello and welcome to the Gospel-Centered Education Podcast. My name is Tom Argersinger and I'm your host today, and my co-host is Kelly Allen.
Hey Tom, on the Gospel-Centered Education Podcast, we explore how we as Jesus followers can connect the dots between education, contemporary culture, and biblical theology and live like Jesus in a broken and challenging world. And today, we have Pastor Josh Hughes with us. Woo-hoo. We are so excited to have you on. Let me tell some of our listeners exactly who you are.
Almost needs no introduction, by the way, but for those that minuscule part of our audience that does not know who he is.
He just so happens to be your pastor.
That's right, he just so happens to be my pastor. I can say that. Go ahead,
yes.
Sorry.
So you are the lead pastor of Four Oaks Church East here in Tallahassee, Florida.
Yes, I am.
Yes. How many years have you been doing that?
I've been on staff at Four Oaks since 04, 05, and been the lead pastor of Four Oaks East since we planted in 2019.
Okay, that's a long time. Okay. Yep. And you also are a proud alumni of CCS.
Yes, finished 8th grade. That was all we could do back in those days. In 1994 was my 8th grade year, I think. And my teacher my 8th grade year was none other than a young, illustrious luminary by the name of Tom Argersinger.
Which probably explains a lot at some level. I don't know, but there was
the secret to my success.
You were a great student. I remember this. You were. He's laughing. I
don't think I was, but thank you.
No, you were, and you could sing even then.
I could sing.
You led worship for a number of years, and you could
that.
sing. And I remember working some with you a little bit on that. So it's a fond memory, honestly. It really is.
Your influence in my life was a big part of my journey into ministry. Just catching a vision for leading worship, and you were the worship leader. 2 worship leaders before me at Four Oaks, and I learned a ton about that from you. So now we get to do ministry again.
I know, isn't that fun?
It's beautiful.
That's awesome. And you also have kids here now at CCS.
I do. In this upcoming school year, we will have 3 of our 4 kids enrolled here at CCS.
Thank you for that investment, man. That means a lot. It really does.
Very happy to be here.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so you also got your MDiv from Reformed Theological Seminary in Orlando, Florida. Is that right?
Yes. That's where I got my formal training for ministry.
Awesome.
Just to supplement what I got from Mr. Argersinger.
I know. So this is kind of like a full circle moment for you, because today we're talking about the intersection between the Christian education and the church.
Yeah.
So it's so cool to have you on here.
It is. It's great to have you, Josh. Thanks so much for being on, man. And I know you're a busy guy, so thank you for taking the time. That's really on my heart a lot, is just how this concept of gospel-centered education really, especially how it integrates and connects with the local church. It's just for those of our listeners who aren't aware, it's a huge question among Christian school people and church people, really, too. There are some Christian schools that are actually associated with the church, the way CCS used to be. But there's a decreasing number of those. A larger number are really more independent Christian schools, which frankly in some ways is weird. It's almost like there can be almost like an orphaning feeling, because an independent Christian school could almost be like an oxymoron in some ways. Yeah. But it's just kind of the way that the Christian culture moved, because back in the day it was really cool to start a school. And then a lot of those churches realized, oh wait, this is way harder and way more complicated than we thought. And so now we're where we are in the 21st century with the complexities and everything. So I really look forward to a conversation with you, just how you see some of that stuff. Yeah. So from your standpoint, Josh, in general, like maybe speaking generally at first, how do you see the intersections between a Christian school that's really moving hopefully towards a gospel-centered education approach and the local church?
Yeah, I think as a parent of kids who need to be educated, I see an immense amount of value in a gospel-centered educational approach that is existing alongside what the local church is doing. And so to zoom out for a second, I would think of Christian schooling under the broad framework of a para-church organization or ministry, particularly in the way CCS is set up. Para, the Greek preposition meaning alongside. Thank you, Reformed Theological Seminary, for teaching me those things. Coming alongside what the church is doing to provide a really important and necessary supplementary service to what the church is seeking to do. And I think there's a ton of of ways that we could probably do that more effectively and be more integrated and be more in partnership and in conversation. But those things tend to be really complex and hard and difficult.
They can be. And then one of the ways I've started to talk about this, and you kind of reflect with me on this and see if this makes sense, and it's fine if it doesn't. But this idea that a gospel-centered school is in some ways going to amplify the voice of the church. Talk to me about how that phrase kind of hits you.
Yeah, if the local church's mission is to present men, women, and children mature in Christ, we want to evangelize them, disciple them, teach them to observe everything that Jesus commanded us. That's the Great Commission. That's the task that's been given to the local church. That's a really, really big task.
Yes.
And there is so much of life that takes place outside of and alongside of what we do on the Lord's Day when we gather, and then when we gather in groups and the different equipping that we do in the church. And so for a school like CCS to be able to amplify what the church is doing is to fill in some of those gaps, to say, okay, all truth is God's truth. Whether it's math, science, history, all the classes that you're teaching and training and investing in the kids in, and situating that in the broader context of the story that God's writing in the world is really, really important. And I see a huge value in that as, one, somebody who was educated in that way, and two, who's seeing my children be educated in that way too. I think that's a really important service and ministry that a gospel-centered school can provide to amplify the voice of the church.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, one of the things we talk a lot about, and I talk with pastors. I have a lot of pastors who are friends, and there was a lot of that. And so we talk a lot about this idea that the school has the privilege of having maybe 10 times access to families than the local church does. And so there's a sense in which if you have that much access, there's a responsibility that goes along with that. There's a privilege that goes along with that. And frankly, there's a way to really mess that up. And so we're trying not to do that because, and that's why I think alignment at some level is really important.
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I think I live with a pretty steady awareness of the fact that, man, I only have so much time with these families, with these students, with these adults. And I'm always grateful to know that we have partners like the teachers and the faculty at CCS who are reinforcing a lot of the same things that we're trying to get done in the ministry of the church. And
I think another one of the things that is really tricky, because we'll touch today on a couple of tricky things, because it is a tricky marriage in a lot of ways. It's tricky sometimes just in theological areas. CCS serves a very wide or broad spectrum of Christian faith. We all gather around the foot of the cross, and we gather around Central Orthodoxy. But the different flavors of Christianity, there's certainly most of those, probably many of those at least, represented at CCS right now. So we've really tried to press in on a truly biblical theology that's really Trinitarian in nature. And I know that's a passion of yours, and I've actually sat in a theology class with you as a teacher, which I thoroughly enjoyed, by the way.
Thank you.
And so talk to me a little bit about the importance of Trinitarian theology when we start talking about Abraham Kuyper's view of the world, and then also the different families with all the facets of struggle they have, and with emotional and special needs and all those kind of things. That's a big topic, I know.
So it's a big question.
I know, right? I'm saying this for big questions.
I'll grab one thread and pull on it and tell me if I'm going the way that you want. I think I love the idea that you can be a little bit more broad, a little bit more ecumenical here, but there are some sort of irreducible minimums of what it means to be sort of, the word evangelical has all sorts of connotations that are not what the sort of bare essence of the word means. But to be a Christian is to believe that God is triune.
Yes.
He is one substance, one ousia, one whatever the Father is. That's the same stuff. The Son is, I used a Latin word there. That's and the Spirit, they're all the same stuff, but there's three distinct persons within that triune being. And this is one of the things that the church settled on very early. It's one of the first controversies that really has to be sort of sifted and sorted through. And so you can have all sorts of convictions or land in a lot of different places on the role of the sign gifts in the life of the church today, or the mode of baptism, or who the right recipients of baptism are, or any number of issues. But for us to be Christians, we are all going to be really united in a Trinitarian sort of theology. But the wonderful thing about a Trinitarian theology is it's not merely just an irreducible sort of minimum for what Christians believe. They would affirm like the Nicene Creed and and the Apostles' Creed and things like that. But it's also a really wonderful and robust sort of pool to swim in terms of the way we understand God as so even when you make a statement that God is love, right? There's some assumptions built into that. There has to be more than one in order for there to be love. That's something that we experience in the Trinity that then overflows to us. And so to have a sort of a robust Trinitarian theology is a real one. It defines kind of who can be in and who can be a part of the school and to be in sort of glad participation and fellowship with us. But it also gives us a lot to explore in terms of knowing this God, and that's kind of what all of this is about, right? You kind of have one of your goals here is to help these kids not only learn read and write and arithmetic, but to understand everything about their education and themselves in light of who God is, and to have a healthy, robust sort of Orthodox Trinitarian theology can give you a lot to work with there.
And that's great. Thank you. So true. And I think it's so important. I'm not sure it's something that maybe the average Christian parent really spends a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah.
It's almost like that's an emphasis within the Christian faith that I think is gaining a lot of traction. I see more books on the bookshelves. Like everybody always knows, there really is a Trinity. Of course there's a Trinity. But the fact that actually matters a lot and is a central issue, I'm not sure everybody, I mean, what do you think, Kelly? Do you think the average parent kind of connects with that as much?
I mean, if you're really thinking about like who your kids are going to school with, it really does help like kind of weed out who can be here and who can't, and who your kids are. So as far as, me as a parent thinking about those things, I want my kids to mingle with kids of the same, faith.
So maybe in a gatekeeping sense.
In a gatekeeping sense, I would say.
And what I'm thinking about, which I think, has a place and everything, but I think even more so, I think what I'm thinking about really is how it informs, how that kind of an emphasis in theology informs on the way we work with various kinds of groups of people.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we talk about sometimes at our church is we have our convictions on any number of things that might be controversial to other Christians who we're in glad partnership with. But we try to not be arrogant, angry, or anxious about any of them.
That's right.
And so I don't have the expectation that my kids are going to hear in every class, with every question that gets asked in their classes at CCS, that everything that they're going to hear is going to line up point by point 100%. With everything our church's doctrinal statement teaches, which is okay. But I know that there's a baseline of orthodoxy that is going to be maintained, and I'm sure that creates questions, and I'm sure you get emails from time to time of parents who are like, this didn't quite pass muster with what we want our kids to hear.
And I actually kind of love those because it shows me people are paying attention and they actually are thinking about theological questions, which frankly is not necessarily where a lot of people live, right? I mean, they don't live necessarily at that level. And I think, so for me even, the doctrine of Trinity even informs on our emphasis in the gospel-centered school with really ministering to the least of these, and what that looks like. And there's a number of ways that we do that. One of the ways that we want to actually drop that seed today, and we're calling this new thing for CCS, Bethesda Academy, and that is it's really close to our hearts here, because God dropped that seed for special education many years ago in a very tearful way, in a sense. So we were in this meeting, probably worth sharing a quick anecdote. We're in this meeting, and administrators at that time, this is probably 25 years ago, sitting around going, should we really get involved in special ed? Because it's really hard. People are really emotional. They're broken. It's a very difficult thing to do. It's expensive to do. Should we even do that? And so we're having this meeting, and somebody said, well, why don't we just stop and pray? And so we stopped our lengthy conversation about all the reasons on both sides, and we just said, we're just going to have some silence and we actually left about silence for 4 or 5 minutes. And by the end of that time, every single person in the room was weeping.
Wow.
And I still get choked up about today because it was just such a clear moment in time where God said, this is something you're supposed to do, right? It's in the DNA of what the school is supposed to be. And we've done, I think, a decent job of that over the years. We work really hard at that. It's not something you find at a lot of private or Christian schools. So this year, through some wonderful parents, one of whom might be related to you, I'm not sure, and just to talk about what does this look like at a deeper level. And so through a lot of conversation, we're saying, well, there's a deeper level to this. We're going to call it Bethesda Academy, and we're going to try to minister to that set of kids that's maybe just below that group that we currently deal with, and help them to understand and have access to this kind of an education. So, and I know it's not a secret. I mean, one of your kids is going to be a part of that. So, I'd love for you to kind of talk about how that relates, not just theological, maybe personally too.
Yeah, I think it's very hard. You talk about the emotion and the desire that parents of kids who are from hard spaces or kids who have special needs, there's a strong desire for them to be able to flourish in the ways that they're able to flourish, in the ways that matter ultimately, and it is a real need. There's a real deficit for programs that are set up for those kinds of kids to succeed, and I think I'm very, very grateful and very proud as an alum of the school, as a parent of the school, that there was faith, that the administration, the faculty, and the board had to take a step like this, because I think we know, again, as Christians, we have a very different way of defining value and worth in a person. That's right. And to create space for people who have different abilities and who maybe don't fit into the normal, what we would call normal, or typical pattern of educational options. Their presence in our ecclesial and educational spaces are actually a prophetic witness against the culture of utility that characterizes the spirit of our age, that indexes your worth to your and your value to your ability to produce.
Productivity.
And we as Christians, we know that is not where your worth and your value comes from. Your worth and your value comes from you are made in the image of God, and you have things to contribute and to add to the flourishing of every ecclesial and educational community, that they would actually be impoverished greatly if they didn't have it. And so I'm not only excited to see how God's going to use Bethesda in the lives of the students who are going to participate in it, but also how he's going to use the students in the life of Community Christian School to make it more into the school that he wants.
That's just beautifully said, Josh, as always, beautifully said. And just because, we were talking before we started today about some work we're going to be doing, hopefully with a school overseas, and just in a partnership kind of way. And it's not like we're not the great white hope. I mean, it's not like we're going to go over and fix their problems. The reality is they have a lot to teach us. And I think they're very similar to what you're saying. I mean, the work that CCS has done with a number of special needs kids is pretty profound. And what we've seen over the years is exactly what you said. That I think we probably learn as much from them as they learn from us.
And there's a beautiful reflection of the heart of Christ in that. We at our church, we've been preaching through Matthew's gospel, and it's been really interesting. We're down getting toward the end. We're in the last week of Jesus' life now, but it's amazing to see. And I think Paul Miller points this out in one of his books. Jesus has this way of seeing people who are in need, people who are overlooked, people who don't fit into the sort of the normal, typical patterns of life. And his pattern is to see them, to stop, to be moved with compassion, and then to move toward them with his redemptive presence. And that should mark us out as his people. To be a disciple of Jesus is to line up behind our rabbi, our teacher, and to see his way of being in the world, his way of seeing the world, and then to let that be reflected in the way that we see and are in the world as well.
Yeah, that's so good, so good. One of the things, and I think what I try to do as head of schools, I take that reality, and then I take the other side of that reality, which sometimes can get shortchanged too. It's like you can fall off the bike on either side, where that really talented, really with it people who have so many gifts, they also need to be nurtured. And that's a lot of Tim Keller's ministry, I think, was really around that. How do you take that group of people? So I think in the past there's been a dearth of emphasis on this, and I think the reality is it's not either or. The reality is, and these people that are so talented, like most people that I've known that are so talented, it's so difficult for them to approach the gospel because there's a lot to fight through, there's a sense more to die to.
Absolutely.
You know, I remember when I was leading worship and then I'd get some really, really good player. Maybe it was your dad, no. Some really, really good player. He'll appreciate that joke probably.
He will.
But really good player. And in my mind, I'm going, oh, this is awesome. You're such a great player. But I just know this is going to be hard for you because you're going to have to die to that ability, die to that talent. On the other side, so many folks on this end, they often know that they don't have everything it takes. They know the culture is not recognizing them, which creates another kind of suffering. And so I think as a Christian school, as a gospel center school, we're really trying to minister to both of those groups. Historically, I think Christian schools have tended to major on this other side. You know, our job is to prepare, you know, the next congressman, or our job is to prepare, which it kind of is, but I don't think you have to choose.
Yeah.
We're not becoming a special ed school. Sometimes people get a little concerned.
Sure.
Well, no. We have a tremendously rigorous program, and that's not going to change. And so these kids in Bethesda, they may either get a modified diploma or even a certificate, you know, with that. So it's not like we're going to, quote, water all that down. We're just simply saying all the things you're saying are true, really are true. And we want to get on the ground floor as much as we can.
And to create space and to make sacrifices for those kids to be able to, for them to not be edited out of the story that God's writing, and, you know, for CCS's vision to answer the call of God, you know, wherever it leads, whenever it comes, wherever I'm butchering.
Yeah, well, that's all right. It's wherever it comes,
wherever it comes, wherever it leads, and whatever it costs.
There it is. Yep.
We want that to be for as many of our kids as we possibly can.
Yeah.
Because that call, even that language tends to incite images in your mind of, you know, the congressman, you know, William Wilberforce overturning the West African slave trade in England. But often the call of God is just going to be a really, really faithful, loving church member, neighbor, doing work, raising a family, being a good friend, being a faithful servant in their local church. And everyone has a part to play. And in Matthew's gospel, and the way Jesus seems to describe it, those who are going to be truly great are not going to be the ones whose names that you hear or who are famous. They're going to be the ones who serve the most faithfully in the most unseen and hidden ways.
So much of it is just being faithful to the call that God places on your particular life. We've talked a little bit about calling and that kind of thing.
I think it's interesting how you guys, as head of school and as pastor of a congregation, you probably face the same type of issues with how to use, you know, people's gifts and talents and how to foster faith. And so it's interesting. Have you, as a, you know, in your church body, struggled as to, you know, how to, I guess, foster faith in individuals who, you know, need a different approach?
Yeah, we've thought a lot about that. And part of the most important step, I think, in that is to say what I said a minute ago, which is to say explicitly to people who may not be thinking this way, or who may not be familiar with that kind of language, to say these people are important and they matter, and here's why. And so I'm thinking of one kid with special needs in our church who tends to be a little bit more vocal, a little bit more disruptive during our worship gatherings, taking time during the service to say, that right there is the sound of God's blessing to our community. Right. Because he's doing something in us. We would be more impoverished as a community if that child weren't a part of our fellowship. Yeah. Because he stands as a reminder of some things that are very, very important. Yeah. And he has value to our body, not only because he's valuable to the Lord, but because of what he contributes, even if it might be a little bit disruptive at times. And so
you
it's
have all of those different dynamics that you have to balance, just like, you know, the school does. It's interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting because we talked about our previous podcast and other things, because there is this really interesting dynamic tension between kind of the role and rights of the individual and the role and the rights of the community. And so when you're talking about a classroom that meets 5 days a week and it's every day all year, you know, on a Sunday it might be a little different, right? If to allow that space. The question is, how much space can you allow on a daily basis when people are trying to engage and do their work and learn? And that's why a lot of people, frankly, why they just go, it's just too hard.
Yeah, I would think even churches do that.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. By the way, Josh, do you think that's like when you go to pastors' conferences and stuff, is that a thing now where more churches are thinking about how do we engage with people with special needs of various kinds?
I don't go to a lot of conferences.
Oh, okay. All right.
Kind of a
Well,
homebody.
you read.
But yeah. No, I think it's a good question. It's not something that I'm hearing a lot about.
It's not a theme.
It's not a theme that I see getting a lot of sort of exposure in that world. I think it's something for me because it's in my own family.
Yeah.
It's a much more pressing top of mind,
Of course.
issue for me. But I think to the point that you made, Kelly, I think there's the mechanics of it and what it looks like, but then there's also upstream of that, I think is a posturing, the way that we posture ourselves toward
Yes.
this, and an openness and a willingness to say, okay, this might make life more complicated, it might make life more messy, but we have an aspiration to reach for all that God has for us here,
Right.
and we're not going to presume or present ourselves as though we're going to do this right all the time, but we want to at least begin with a heart that reflects the heart of God for what's important to Him. We want what moves His heart to be what moves ours, and we want the things that He desires for our community to be the things that we want, that we desire for our community. And we're going to get it wrong a lot, and that's okay, because there's a
It's
gospel
messy
for that.
just by the very nature of it. It's not an easy thing to do.
Well, the great thing about a gospel-centered approach to education is that reality of we're not going to do this right is already baked in,
Right.
but we're putting the solution to the problems that we're going to have right up front.
Yeah, and that's what we said really with the advent of Bethesda. Really from the get-go, we even said to the parents involved, to your family and to others, it's an iterative process. It's not like we're going to get this perfectly because it is complex. Yeah. We're going to use all of our knowledge and experience, and fortunately we have a lot of that on our staff. But the reality is there's an individuation sort of this whole thing, and there's a sense that we want to make sure that we're continually evaluating what we're doing, and that's why we're not really opening it up to the general public yet, because we're basically this is a proof text, if you will. This is a proving product. What's that called? Product proving. There's a word for this. I know.
Proof of concept.
Proof of concept. There it is. Boom. Proof of concept.
I didn't learn that in seminary.
That was
I don't know where I
though.
picked that one up.
That must have been in other jobs that you had.
Yeah, probably.
Right along the way. So, yeah. So the other thing that I think a gospel-centered education is really mandated in many ways to do, and how to do it is tricky. And again, back to that local church and the school, and that is family ministry. One of the things that we see here, we talked a little bit about this off camera, what we see here is an increasing number of folks who don't really have a church home ever since COVID or whatever other situation. They don't really have a recent church home. And one of the things that we require is we have everyone to have a church home, and we ask for a pastor's reference. And it sometimes gets interesting as to what we receive when we ask for those pastor's references. And so as we amplify the voice of the church, we're also trying to be a conduit to the church as well. And so I don't know if that's a question, but that's really more of a statement, to say we're trying to do that for the local church. But the landscape has shifted a lot. And maybe you can talk about that from your standpoint as a pastor.
Yeah, I think there's so I'm not speaking for CCS here. This is just me. And so all caveats, all disclaimers aside, the local church is what Jesus died for. The local church is the hope of the world. It's not the plan B, C, it's the plan A to Z of what God is doing in the world, and it's beautiful and it's glorious. It's messy, it's hard. The church is always going to be difficult and complex. Everybody's got some level of church hurt that's been around for a while. I carry plenty myself, but despite all of that, the church is the thing that the gates of hell is not going to prevail against. And we've been added into this beautiful story where God redeeming His bride through the church is sort of the main thread that God is weaving throughout the history of this world, and it's all moving to this glorious, beautiful conclusion. And so I think for me, I would just say, with no judgment, not to heap shame on anybody, man, I would love for everybody who has a student involved at CCS to find it doesn't even need to be our local church, to be involved in There's
Amen.
A lot of healthy churches in town,
Yep.
a lot of really faithful, godly, gifted pastors, elder teams that are doing a great job shepherding their churches. And so having, as important as gospel-centered education is, that's meant to be supplemental to this place where your family finds its primary sort of spiritual life that's nurtured in the context of the body of Christ, where you're sitting under the preaching of God's word, where you're taking the Lord's Supper regularly, where you're being called on to confess your sin, being exhorted to obey God's commands. I think that's such an important thing. And have given the rest of my life to just beating that drum and saying, this is where it's at. As hard as it is, as difficult as it is so very worth it, because that's where ministers minister and servants serve, and this is where God puts the manifold, His manifold wisdom on display for the world to see. The local church is the pillar and buttress of the truth, Paul says in 1 Timothy. And we tend to think of it as being backwards, that the truth is the pillar and buttress for the church, and it is. But at the same time, the inverse is also true. It's to the church that this has been entrusted and given. And so I would love to see CCS grow in favor in encouraging families to say, hey, we love you, we're for you. We're very committed to what we do here. We're very excited about what we do here, but we never want this to be in competition or to be a substitute or a replacement for meaningful investment in the local church.
I would imagine that a lot of parents, well, maybe not a lot of parents, but some parents would say, well, my kid's in Christian education all week. We can sleep in on Sunday because they get it all week. So,
and I get it. Life is full. We got 4 teenagers at our house. Life is like really full. And I understand it's very easy to want to sleep in and to not go, and there's all sorts of competing allegiances, and in a world where you have a lot of opportunities to do travel sports and to go on vacation, all that. And I'm not anti-sports or vacation or any of that. Right. It's just that, man, it's so interesting when the writer of Hebrews, he's warning this group of ethnically Jewish believers who are experiencing persecution and hardship. They're being tempted to go back. To forsake Jesus and go back to Judaism. He says Jesus is better, and one of the things that he calls them to keep them from falling away is to not give up meeting together, in the context of the assembly, as is the habit of some, but exhort one another every day as long as it is called today.
That's great to hear, because that really is the ethos that CCS has. But it's also one that we really are figuring out how to press into that as the times change, and as people see things so differently. And one of the reasons, there's many reasons why what you said are true, mostly because it's in the Bible, but there's other just logical reasons too. But part of it is, I think, that a lot of people don't realize that when they divorce themselves from the local church, you not only miss out on all those positive aspects that you just mentioned, but you also... it's much more difficult to say that you're living under authority. And that's almost like that's one of those buzzword hard topics today, right? Nobody really wants to think about authority very much.
Or accountability.
Right. Yeah, they're sisters, I guess. And so we are very cognizant of the fact that ultimately we don't have God-given authority. And so...
that's got to make it really, really complex, difficult.
It really does. I mean, it really does. And that's one of the reasons why I think why independent Christian schools, in one sense, are more challenging, because you don't have that same covering. Nowadays, that's true legally as well as spiritually. And so, that's a good topic for another time. There's a lot there. It is. But that's why that's why we really want to continue to invest ourselves in what does that relationship look like, so that it can be robust as it can between the local church and a school like CCS. But I think we don't talk about that aspect enough these days, I don't think, about the issue of accountability.
No, I agree with that, and not to, again, my view is not Community Christian Schools' views, but it seems like Jesus says, for the good of your soul, in Matthew 18, when he describes the process of church discipline that culminates for a person who refuses to listen to entreaties to turn away from sin, that you would have a community of faith that loves you enough to set you outside of the visible sort of community of faith, in hopes that the flesh will be put away and you will be brought back into fellowship on the last day, is a severe mercy, but it's a mercy to your soul. And to distance yourself from that accountability actually might feel like freedom, but it's actually the kind of freedom that puts you in real danger.
Right. And that's, again, those are hard conversations, right? And so because we obviously have a set of rules here for this community, and we believe they're biblical. We believe they are corollaries in a sense, but it doesn't replace. And that sounds like the theme of what we're saying.
Yeah.
The gospel-centered, whether just a generic Christian school or a gospel-centered school, whatever, are not a replacement. They were never designed to be a replacement for the local church. They were along, as you said earlier, to come alongside, to come alongside that ministry, to amplify the voice, to amplify the ministry, but not to replace it. And I say that a lot, actually. Do you think that's understood by? I mean, you have a lot of friends who are parents here. Just in general, do you think that's clear to people, or do you think that's something we really need to work on talking about more? I mean, you can obviously be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a wonderful community of parents that, for the most part, understand that. But I think, as a parent, you can fall into that. Like I said, my kids have gotten, Christian education all week.
So they're good.
But it's not all about the kids, honestly.
No.
You do, as a family, you need that accountability of the local church. So, but I don't know if it's thought out like that, because life gets busy, and you do fall away sometimes.
There's this forming that's supposed to be taking place of the whole family,
exactly,
right? Including, first and foremost with the parents. And so, just as youth ministries found out a long time ago, you can't minister to the kids without ministering to the families.
Yeah.
There's a sense in which what we do is very similar. It's just that some of those people are disconnected, and it's probably the best way to say it. They're disconnected from the local church.
Well, I think to that point, Kelly, that's really important. So Eugene Peterson, one of my favorite authors, he has a book called Like Do Your Youth, DEW. And it's a book on parenting teenagers. And so a lot of my parenting thoughts are filtered through the lens of teenagers, because that's all I have right now. But he has this really interesting statement. He wrote this before a lot of the challenges that parents are facing now with technology and all of that. But he says, one of the, I'm just going to paraphrase, I'm paraphrasing it, but he says, one of the gifts you give to your children as they enter adolescence, and this he calls it a season of uprootedness, is you allow them to look over your shoulder as you follow Jesus. And you open up your life to them, not just the good parts, not just the moments when you're a mature, godly exemplar of Christianity, but also when the real you comes out and you lose your temper and you sin or whatever, and to not root your life in a faith community where you're being encouraged, where you're getting opportunities to do that, really could impoverish your kid's ability to understand what it means to make that transition that's very necessary from this is my parents' faith, this is our family faith. No, this is what I believe about Jesus, and this is what I believe about the gospel, and this is what I believe it means for me to be a follower of Jesus.
Because they're watching you.
Because they're watching you, and they're watching your habits, and they're watching your priorities, and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that's always important, but especially as kids begin to sort of see you not just as a person that gets it all right all the time, who the person they want to be like when they grow up, but like, I see the discontinuity between what you say and what you do, and that's always a fun place to be in. And your kids are all adults now, and you understand that in a totally new way. But to give them an opportunity to see you make your way through that in the context of a family of believers is a real gift to your kids.
Go ahead, please.
I'm sorry. What are some other things that you think parents could be doing at home? Like, I have my kids in Christian school. We're involved in a church. What else could we be doing at home? I love living it out, living out your faith in front of the kids. What else could we be doing? Yeah,
I think I'll give a scriptural one and a cultural one. So scripturally, I think just having building your family's life around not just commitment to the church, but commitment to God's word and prayer. So family devotions, everybody's like, oh no, how do we do this well? And I'm like on a mission to like demystify and simplify what people do in family worship. Like, hey, just read a passage, talk about it, and pray. Like, when you do that, you've done it. Just to get and maybe sing every once in a while. If somebody can play the piano, do a little something. So looking for ways to make sure that your family life, the Word of God is central to it, alongside of your commitment to the local church. But I think another thing I would encourage families to do, especially as kids are getting older and they're having to navigate okay, how do I let my kids begin to get some exposure to the world and
because it changes
culture
as they get older.
And so I'm going to kind of rabbit trail for a little second off that. So I kind of think of parenting in two different phases. So there's the early phase of parenting where you're like, the world is scary, it's dangerous, like stay in the yard, like we got to keep you protected from the scary world out there. And that's really important when your kids are small. But as your kids get older, as they enter the teen years and all of that, you can't just keep them in the yard. You have to take them out into the world and show them what the world is like and let them process what they're seeing with you. And I've seen a lot of parents kill it in that first phase, but never really make the transition to the second phase.
They stay in the first phase and they just
keep the world out there, and then their kids go off to college or move out of the house and get a job for the first time, and they're like encountering this world that they're not prepared for because everything has been set up to protect them from it. And I'm very much, again, rooted in that second phase of parenting where it's like, okay, well, let's watch that show or that movie, and then let's talk about it at the dinner table. What are let's be good students of the artifacts that culture is producing, and just give it a real quick assessment through the lens of the Bible. What's this saying about what's important? What's this saying about human beings? What's this saying about sort of, what's called expressive individualism, right? This idea that, I have to be true to that which is within, right? That's the ethic of our age, right? What is that saying about the value of that? And how do we think about that as Christians? So Dan Strange, in his book, I think it's called Plugging In, he talks about doing this, enter, explore, expose, and then evangelize, right? Enter into the world as it exists, explore it, ask good questions about it, expose what's faulty about it, and then bring the gospel to bear in it. And even something as simple as watching a show and pausing and saying, okay, what's going on right here? What's being said? And how do we think about that as Christians? And giving your kids a framework and language to assess the things that they're seeing and to begin to filter it through a Christian sort of way of seeing the world. To not be scared of that. I think we get paralyzed because there's so much going on, and it's easy for us to become afraid. We don't need to be afraid of those things because the Word of God and the gospel has real cogent and coherent answers to the questions that people are asking and that our kids are asking and that the world is asking. And to not be afraid to say, like, okay, what's helpful here? What are they getting right and what are they getting wrong? And how do we think about it as Christians? So just to have a willingness to step into that, I think would be really
love the thought of exposing it.
Yeah.
A lot of people don't even enter into that with their children, but it's so important to have those conversations.
Yeah.
But just exposing it is so important, saying that's wrong, and this is why, because it doesn't line up against God's word.
Yeah, and a lot of so Mark Sayers talks about the lie of secularism, and the lie of our culture today is that you can have the kingdom without the king, right? You can have a world that's just and where there's equality and where human dignity is valued, but there can be sort of transcendent moral laws, but we just don't want anything to do with the transcendent moral lawgiver, and that doesn't work. And so often there are things that are good in there. It's like, yes, we should value human dignity and those things matter, but why? And what's missing from the story that's being told here? And how does Christianity offer a better answer and a better story in which to understand that?
That's so good.
That reminds me of the Tim Keller framework, plus minus plus, to which we've added times and equals. So for those who aren't aware, the plus is what's good about the worldview that's being presented in this piece or whatever it is. The minus sign is, well, what doesn't line up with Scripture? And then the other plus is, how is Jesus' way better? How is it more satisfactory? And then we add to that times, which is a reminder that we are walking with people in that process. It's not a one-off thing. And then the equals reminds us that the ground is equal at the foot of the cross.
That's good.
The ground is level. And so that's what we try to do. And mostly it's a good full circle thing as we begin to close, to be able to say that what you just described that parents should be doing is a lot of what we try to do every day. We're trying to help connect those dots and teach people how to connect those dots for themselves, because it doesn't come naturally to most people to make those connections, especially if they don't like operating in the world of ideas. Then even for people watching the podcast today, we've talked a lot about ideas, and that's very frustrating for some people. It's like, I just want the 3 steps of how to do this better. And you did that when you talked about the parents, but I think you have to think a little bit about those ideas in order to do it.
Yeah, there's a book I love called After Virtue by a guy named Alistair McIntyre, and he talks about connecting the dots. He has this great line. I use it in my preaching all the time. You know exactly what I'm about to say. He says, before I can answer the question, what must I do? I must first answer the prior question of what story am I a part? And that's where I think gospel-centered education is so helpful, because it takes all of this knowledge and all of this learning and all of these exciting things that our kids are encountering in the world, and it places it in a story that can give you a sort of meaningful and beautiful and good and true story to interpret it. And so he has this really funny parable at the beginning. He says, say I'm at a bus stop, and a man walks up to me and he says, the name of the common wood duck is Histrionicus, Histrionicus, Histrionicus. and he stops.
Nice.
And he says, I understood the words that he's just said, but until I know the story, I have no way of interpreting it. So maybe he says, well, maybe he mistook me from someone he bumped into at the library yesterday who was asking a question about ducks.
Yeah.
Maybe he just came from a therapy appointment where he's terrified of talking to strangers, and his therapist says, "Go and say something random to someone." He said, or maybe he's a Russian spy who thinks he's mistaken me for a contact, and he's given me the code word. He's like, the story you're in makes all the difference in the way that you interpret and the meaning you make out of the facts that you encounter. And that's what I'm so excited for when it comes to gospel-centered education and connecting those dots, because it helps this beautiful, wonderful world that God made and all these things that we want our kids to learn. And it sets it in a cogent, coherent, and beautiful story of what God's doing in the world.
Yeah, amen. Well said. And all I would add to that is just to simply say that for those who listen to these kind of conversations and go, well, it just seems like it's really hard. It's really complex. Well, there is complexity to it. But I think a good takeaway for me from this conversation is there's a tremendous amount of hope. There's a capital H hope here. And out of all of those, the hard things in culture, the way the church operates, whether or not how people see the church, how people get involved with education and how they look at all that, those are important things. But ultimately, as you pointed out earlier, Josh, good way to end, I think, the purpose of the church will not be thwarted.
That's right.
The purpose of God through the church will not be thwarted. It doesn't matter.
That's right.
What your perspective is. That's the biblical truth. And as much as gospel-centered education can come alongside that, then I'm like, yay. I think that's awesome. So, man, a pleasure. Always a pleasure talking with you, but especially a pleasure having you on today. So thank you for that.
Thanks so much for having me.
You bet. We appreciate you guys tuning in to us today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And we're not going to announce what's next because we don't know yet. We'll figure it out. With a couple of weeks, we'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode. So thanks so much for tuning in. God bless you. And remember, if you forget everything else that we said, Jesus is Lord. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Gospel-Centered Education Podcast, brought to you by Community Christian School in Tallahassee, Florida. You can find us online at myccs.org.